In 2019, Texas released 5,000 bison onto 336,000 acres of desert rangeland that hadn't seen wild bison in 140 years. Scientists expected them to graze, reproduce, and maybe restore some grassland. Within 3 years, the landscape transformed so dramatically that ecologists called it the fastest ecosystem recovery they'd ever documented. Rivers changed course. Vegetation exploded. Species that hadn't been seen in decades suddenly reappeared. The bison didn't just adapt to the land, they rebuilt it from scratch. What happened in Texas is now forcing scientists to rewrite everything they thought they knew about ecosystem restoration, keystone species, and how fast nature can recover when you give it the right catalyst. Here's what the bison did that nobody predicted. The Caprock Canyons region in the Texas Panhandle was collapsing. This wasn't slow degradation. This was accelerating ecosystem failure. The landscape had been cattle grazed for over a century, and the damage was catastrophic. Here's what the land looked like. Invasive mesquite and juniper trees covered areas that should have been grassland. Native grasses that once dominated the plains had been replaced by non-native species that provided almost no ecological value. Soil erosion was so severe that topsoil was disappearing at rates that wouldn't naturally replenish for centuries. The Caprock Escarpment showed gullies carved by erosion that exposed bedrock in places that should have been covered by 2 feet of soil. Water systems were failing. Creeks that historically flowed year-round now only ran after storms. The water table was dropping because vegetation wasn't capturing rainfall effectively. Springs that Native American tribes had used for thousands of years were drying up. The entire hydrological cycle was broken, but here's what made scientists think bison might fix it. Before European settlement, an estimated 30 million bison roamed North America's grasslands. They weren't just living on the land, they were maintaining it. Their grazing patterns, wallowing behavior, and migration routes created and sustained the prairie ecosystem. When bison disappeared in the 1880s, the prairies started dying. Scientists began to suspect that restoring bison might restore prairies. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department partnered with private landowners to create the largest bison restoration project in modern history. They sourced 5,000 bison from conservation herds across the country. Genetic testing confirmed these were pure bison without cattle DNA, and released them into Caprock Canyons and surrounding private ranches in spring 2019. Then they waited to see what would happen. What happened was beyond anyone's predictions. Within 6 months, the bison fundamentally altered the physical landscape through behaviors that cattle don't exhibit. The first change scientists noticed was wallowing. Bison roll in dirt to remove parasites, scratch itches, and regulate temperature. Each bison creates circular depressions in the ground, about 10 feet across and 6 inches deep. Here's why this matters ecologically. 5,000 bison creating wallows across 336,000 acres means tens of thousands of micro-depressions that capture rainfall. Before the bison, rain hit hard-packed soil and ran off immediately, contributing to erosion, soaked into the ground, and recharged the water table. Groundwater levels in the restoration area increased by an average of 3 feet, but the wallows did something unexpected. They created microhabitats. Water pooling in wallows attracted insects. Insects attracted birds. Birds deposited seeds from native plants in their droppings. The wallows became germination sites for vegetation that hadn't grown in the area for decades. By year 2, native wildflowers were blooming in and around wallows while the surrounding land remained relatively barren. The bison also began selective grazing that was completely different from cattle behavior. Cattle are continuous grazers that eat vegetation down to the ground and keep it short. Bison are selective grazers that prefer certain grasses, leave others alone, and move constantly. This creates a mosaic of tall grass, short grass, and bare ground. Ecologists call this the grazing lawn effect. When bison graze an area and move on, The grasses they ate regenerate with more vigor because the grazing stimulates growth. The grasses they ignored provide shelter for small mammals and ground-nesting birds. The bare patches they create through heavy traffic become seed beds for new plants. The result is dramatically increased biodiversity compared to uniform cattle grazing. One of the most severe problems in the Caprock region was invasive woody plants. Mesquite and juniper trees had invaded areas that should have been grassland. These trees are water hogs that suck up groundwater through deep taproots and provide almost no value to native wildlife. By 2018, mesquite and juniper covered an estimated 40% of the restoration area. The standard solution is mechanical removal. Remove the stumps, replant native grasses. This costs about $300 per acre and needs to be repeated every few years as trees regrow. For 336,000 acres, that's $100 million just for initial clearing. Texas couldn't afford it. They hoped the bison might slow the invasion. The bison eliminated it. Here's what happened. Bison don't eat mesquite or juniper, but they rub against them. 5,000 bison rubbing against saplings for 3 years killed nearly 90% of young trees under 10 feet tall. The trees couldn't survive constant abuse from animals that weigh 2,000 pounds. Adult trees survived, but without young trees replacing them, the invasion stopped spreading. But the bison did something even more effective. They changed the fire ecology. Grasslands need periodic fires to remain healthy. Fire kills woody plants, but most prairie grasses survive because their root systems are underground. Before bison, the landscape had too many fire breaks. Invasive trees creating shaded areas, non-native grasses that don't burn well. Fires couldn't spread. After 2 years of bison grazing, the landscape had continuous fuel. Native grasses had returned, covering areas that were previously bare soil. In 2021, a natural fire sparked by lightning burned across 50,000 acres in the restoration area. It burned hot and fast, killing 85% of remaining mesquite and juniper trees. The grassland that emerged the following spring was the healthiest it had been in over a century. Scientists hadn't planned this. They just let the bison graze and nature did the rest. The cost of removing invasive trees through bison and fire was essentially zero compared to $100 million for mechanical removal. This is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Hydrologists noticed that creek beds in the restoration area were shifting. Streams that had carved deep, narrow channels through erosion were widening and becoming shallower. This is the opposite of what happens in degraded landscapes where erosion makes channels deeper. Here's the mechanism. Bison concentrate near water sources. Their hooves churn up soil along creek banks. This seems destructive, but it's actually restorative. The churned soil combined with increased vegetation from bison grazing creates natural water-absorbing barriers. Instead of water rushing through deep channels and eroding them deeper, water spreads across wider areas and soaks into the ground. The technical term is stream channel evolution reversal. Streams cut deeper into the ground over time through a process called downcutting. This lowers the water table, kills vegetation near the stream, and accelerates erosion. The Caprock streams had been downcutting for 80 years. But here's what the bison did. Their activity raised the stream beds. Soil churned by hooves combined with trapped vegetation created natural check dams. Water backed up behind these barriers, deposited sediment, and gradually filled in the deep channels. By 2022, streams that had been 8 feet deep and 10 feet wide in 2019 were now 3 feet deep and 30 feet wide. This is insane for several reasons. First, stream restoration projects normally take decades and cost millions of dollars per mile. The bison did it in 3 years for free. The wider, shallower streams created wetland habitat that hadn't existed in the area since the 1800s. Third, the restored streams recharged the water table even more effectively than wallows, causing year-round flow to return to creeks that had been seasonal for 50 years. Hydrologists from Texas AANDM published a paper in 2023 calling this the most rapid natural stream restoration ever documented in North American grasslands. They literally couldn't believe bison could reshape hydrology this quickly. Within 2 years of bison introduction, wildlife surveys detected species that hadn't been recorded in the Caprock region since the early 1900s. The first was the burrowing owl. These small owls nest in abandoned prairie dog burrows. Prairie dogs had declined dramatically due to cattle grazing and poisoning programs. Without prairie dogs, burrowing owls disappeared. The bison restoration created favorable conditions for prairie dogs. More native grasses meant better food. Disturbed soil from wallows created easier digging. Prairie dog colonies increased by 300% in the restoration area. Burrowing owls showed up immediately after. Swift foxes returned in 2021. These small foxes disappeared from the Texas Panhandle in the 1960s when grasslands converted to cropland. They need extensive native grassland with prairie dog colonies for food. The restored landscape provided both. Trail cameras documented at least 15 swift foxes by late 2022. Mountain plovers, a threatened grassland bird, began nesting in the restoration area in 2022. These birds need short grass prairie with bare ground patches. That's exactly what bison grazing creates. Before bison, mountain plovers hadn't nested in Caprock canyons since 1987. After bison, breeding pairs were documented within 3 years. But here's the most shocking return. In spring 2023, a black-footed ferret was photographed by a trail camera in the restoration area. Black-footed ferrets are one of North America's most endangered mammals. They were declared extinct in the wild in 1987 and have only been reintroduced to a handful of locations through intensive captive breeding programs. None of those reintroduction sites are in Texas. The ferret documented in Caprock canyons didn't come from a reintroduction program. Scientists believe it dispersed naturally from populations in Kansas or New Mexico, traveling over 300 miles to reach the restored bison range. It came because the ecosystem could now support it, which required native grassland, which required bison. Soil scientists analyzing the restoration area documented changes that normally take centuries. In 2019, soil samples showed severely degraded conditions, low organic matter content, poor water retention, minimal microbial activity. By 2022, the same sampling locations showed soil quality improvements that textbooks say should take 100 to 200 years. Here's what bison did to the soil. Each bison produces about 50 pounds of manure per day. 5,000 bison produce 250,000 pounds of manure daily. That's 45,000 tons per year. Unlike cattle manure, which is concentrated in feedlots or pastures, bison manure is distributed across the entire landscape because bison are constantly moving. Bison manure isn't just fertilizer, it's a microbial inoculant. Each pound of bison dung contains billions of bacteria and fungi that improve soil health. When mixed into soil by insects and weathering, these microbes enhance nutrient cycling, increase water retention, and improve soil structure. But here's the multiplier effect. Better soil grows more plants. More plants mean more root systems. More roots mean more organic matter added to soil when roots die and decompose. More organic matter means better soil. This is a positive feedback loop that accelerates with time. Soil organic matter content in the restoration area increased from an average of 1.2% in 2019 to 3.8% in 2023. For context, every 1% increase in soil organic matter increases water holding capacity by 20,000 gallons per acre. The restoration area gained the ability to hold 175 billion additional gallons of water compared to pre-bison conditions. Water infiltration rates also transformed. In 2019, soil absorbed water at 0.3 inches per hour during rainfall events. This caused most rain to run off as erosion rather than soaking in. By 2023, water infiltration rates reached 1.8 inches per hour in heavily grazed areas. The soil could absorb 6 times more water per hour than before bison arrived. The bison restoration was primarily ecological, but it created economic benefits that are now paying for the entire project and generating profit. The first benefit was carbon sequestration. Restored grasslands with healthy soil absorb and store atmospheric carbon. The Caprock Restoration Area is now sequestering an estimated 150,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually. At current carbon credit prices of about $15 per ton, that's $2.25 million per year in potential carbon credit revenue. Texas Parks and Wildlife is working with carbon credit registries to monetize this. The bison herd literally pays for itself through carbon markets, while also restoring the land. But here's the unexpected revenue source. Ecotourism exploded. Caprock Canyon State Park had about 45,000 visitors per year. After bison, visitation increased to 180,000 per year by 2022. People want to see wild bison herds, especially in landscapes where bison roaming looks like what North America looked like 300 years ago. Each visitor spends an average of $85 on lodging, food, and recreation in nearby towns. That's $15 million annually in local economic activity directly attributable to bison tourism. The surrounding counties, which were economically depressed from declining agriculture, are now thriving from tourism and conservation-related jobs. Private ranchers adjacent to the state park are converting from cattle to bison operations, not because they're environmentalists, but because bison are more profitable. Bison meat sells for premium prices, bison require less supplemental feeding than cattle, and bison restore rather than degrade rangeland, which reduces long-term costs. The Texas bison restoration is forcing ecologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about ecosystem recovery. The standard model says that heavily degraded landscapes take decades or centuries to restore even with intensive human intervention. The Caprock restoration achieved in 3 years what shouldn't be possible in 30. Here's what makes scientists uncomfortable. The restoration didn't require planting native species, removing invasive species, engineering stream channels, or amending soil. All of those interventions are standard practice in restoration ecology. Texas did none of them. They just added bison and let nature do the work. This suggests that for grassland ecosystems, the most effective and cost-efficient restoration method is reintroducing the keystone species rather than managing individual ecosystem components. It's cheaper, faster, and produces better results than human engineering. But here's the controversial implication. If bison can restore Texas grasslands this quickly, they could probably restore degraded grasslands across the entire Great Plains. That's roughly 800 million acres spanning from Canada to Mexico. Most of it is now used for cattle ranching on degraded land that's losing topsoil, draining aquifers, and providing minimal wildlife habitat. Converting even 10% of Great Plains ranching to bison-based restoration could sequester billions of tons of carbon, restore hydrology across millions of acres, and bring back species that are currently on the edge of extinction. The economic benefits from carbon credits, ecotourism, and premium bison products would likely exceed current cattle ranching revenue. The barrier isn't ecological or economic, it's cultural. Ranching communities have raised cattle for generations. Suggesting they switch to bison feels like erasing their heritage. But the data from Texas is becoming impossible to ignore. Bison work better economically and ecologically than cattle in most grassland environments. The Texas project proved that rapid, large-scale ecosystem restoration is possible if you reintroduce the right species. This is now driving similar projects across the continent. Wyoming and South Dakota are planning bison restorations totaling over 1 million acres. Canadian provinces are discussing even larger projects. But here's what makes the Texas case study so powerful. They didn't restore pristine wilderness. They restored severely degraded land that had been abused for over a century. If bison can fix that level of damage in 3 years, they can fix almost anything. This gives hope to landscape restoration efforts worldwide because it proves that ecosystems can recover faster than anyone thought possible. The bison in Texas aren't just grazing, they're engineering entire landscapes through behaviors that evolved over millions of years to create and maintain grasslands. Rivers change course, soil rebuilds, species return, and it happens faster than scientists thought was biologically possible. What happened in Texas after 5,000 bison were released onto desert plains isn't just about bison. It's about rediscovering that nature has mechanisms for healing itself that are faster and more effective than anything humans have engineered. We just have to give it the right catalyst and get out of the way.